Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense. Today, I am so excited, Rap. Today is April 27th. And do you know what day it is? What national holiday it is?
I do, but I'm going to let you tell us.
Okay, well, today's April 27th, and it marks National Tell a Story Day. I am so excited because on this month's podcast, we will be highlighting the importance of storytelling inside the courtroom. At Gideon's Promise, we recognize that client-centered defense is the key to changing the criminal legal system and achieving a more equal path to public defense. We understand the integral role storytelling plays in providing a client-centered defense, and we have some of the best storytellers in the game that are joining us today. It is a public defender's job to not only accurately share their client's story to the court, but to also do it in a way that ensures the accused is seen as a human being. Public defender caseloads are often double what the American Bar Association recommends. However, effective public defenders take the time to learn their client's stories quickly and effectively and understand their lived experience. Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by two wonderful guests who will give us more insight into why storytelling is such an important skill for public defenders. We have Jeff Sherr, the training director at the National Association for Public Defense, and Patrice Fulcher, who is the training director from the Office of Public Defender, Maryland. Both Patrice and Jeff have been faculty members with Gideon's Promise since its founding in 2007. I am so excited. I have the original OGs of storytelling with me. I've had the opportunity to watch them train countless classes over the year, participate in storytelling, and I have to tell you, I've learned a lot from Jeff and Patrice in my own work when I have to tell the story of Gideon's Promise. And so I'm so excited that we get to interview them today to celebrate National Tell a Story Day.
No, I join your enthusiasm. I mean, Jeff and Patrice, you're both dear friends, your family. We wouldn't have Gideon's Promise if it weren't for you guys. I mean, Jeff, I just want the audience to know when I was first thinking of moving to Georgia from DC, you're one of the first people I called to think about how to take some of these ideas that are kind of central to Gideon's Promise and weave them into a state system. And then I got to Georgia, and Patrice, who was a public defender in Georgia at the time, actually doing death penalty work in Georgia, was one of the first people I met in Georgia. And the two of you have really been rolling with us ever since. Jeff, there wouldn't be the amazing training at National Association for Public Defense if it weren't for you. And Patrice, we wouldn't have our first statewide partnership in Maryland if it weren't for you. So grateful to you guys. I just wanted to echo that, Illy. So before we get started, but I'm gonna go ahead and kick off the first question and throw it to Patrice. And just curious, what role does storytelling play for public defenders? Why is it so important for public defenders, Patrice?
So I just have to start off by saying thank you so much to Illy and Rap and for Jeff to be here with you. This is just an amazing opportunity and a phenomenal day because as storytellers, we know that telling stories is everything. It's everything in public defense. So when you talk about the scope of storytelling in public defense, it is everything. Studies have shown that our brains respond favorably when we hear good stories. And a good story is one that has a beginning, a middle, and the end, and one that has moments of conflict or tension. So when we hear a good story, right, our brain releases chemicals that induce feelings of love, trust, and empathy, and increase our ability to focus, process data, and remember what we hear. It also allows the listener to experience the story, right, feel it, and connect with the speaker on an emotional level. So, storytelling for public defenders is a highly effective tool, a tool that can be utilized to compel prosecutors, probation officers, judges, juries, and the broader community to see our clients as multifaceted human beings and not just, another case file, a number on a docket sheet, or a label that society has placed upon them. Storytelling allows public defenders to amplify their client's story in such a meaningful way that motivates these decision makers in this criminal system to feel, to empathize, and to act in favor of our client's stated interests.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I mean, I think that's right. If it weren't for public defenders, these stories don't make it into spaces where such important decisions about human lives are made. No, thank you for that, Patrice.
So Jeff, to you, Patrice just laid out the impact that storytelling has in the system. But why is it so critical that public defenders know how to tell the story, right? We talked about the result. Like why when I first start working with you years ago, I'm gonna tell our age, 15 years ago, right? We had we were working on trial skills. We were working on the fundamentals of the basis. And over time, you started to implement this part of it. Why is it important that they know how to do it? Because everybody says, oh, I can tell a great story, but how to do it? Why is that important?
Thanks, Illy. But before I answer that, I just want to echo Illy and thank you. It's great seeing you both, Illy, Rap, and seeing Patrice. I am grateful to be part of this community. And thanks for doing this podcast on top of all the other things that you do. This is a great gift to the world. This is out there free for people who are interested in this stuff. Patrice said a lot of things that I can kind of take to another step, I think, when she was talking about how, storytelling is what role it plays. And when you think about how decisions get made in the law, they talk about in law school and in the press, and that ideally this is a place that's dispassionate, where there are people who look at these facts and they look at the instructions they get from a judge and they apply the facts to the law and they come up with this dispassionate decision. And that's why you supposedly have juries that are not connected with anybody and kind of can coldly look at these facts. The reality is there aren't very many human beings that work that way, and very few that would work that way in a group. When you put them on a jury of 12 people, it's not about facts and law. It's all driven by emotions and the folks' emotional responses to what happened. And stories are designed to connect emotions. And it's not that this not part of an argumental system or an adversarial system. Stories themselves are arguments about the behavior of the characters you see within them. And they're leading the audience to feel a certain way. Did I like the way that character behaved? Are they a hero? Are they worth my investment in them? And a story takes you on this journey to get that emotional response. And as Patrice was talking about, the emotions that are triggered when you start to use a story form, a narrative form, get into the oxytocins released in your brain, so you have empathy. There's cortisol that's released in your brain, so you pay attention to what is happening just by using a story form. And we're brought up with that, from children on. We're constantly bombarded with stories. Commercials are these mini stories, even billboards are telling a story. We're constantly bombarded with stories to get us to make decisions. So that's critical in our world to help guide our audience, jurors or a judge in some situations, to make a decision that goes with what we want for that case, whether it's not guilty or a lesser included. In most of the cases that were out there, prosecutors are trying to focus on two emotions. They can run with fear and vengeance. And you don't necessarily need stories to tap into those. Those can be just little moments in time of triggering an adrenaline response of, oh my God, and that we need to get even for that.
Wow.
For us, most of our cases, if we have a case where someone did do something, but maybe not what they're charged with or not the extreme they're charged with, what we're trying to do is tap in with love and empathy and compassion. And as Patrice said, stories are a way to get you into those emotions. We're just giving a logical recitation of facts. We're not going to trigger the emotions. They're going to keep people in this part of their brain where they're processing logically, but they're going to have this fear and vengeance thing that's ramped up from the prosecutors. So for public defenders, we need to understand how stories are structured and how to perform stories so we can get the jury to have the emotions and see that argument in a way so they see our character, our client in most cases, in a light where they're hearing a story that tells an argument and they get it and they understand what happened there, whatever our theory of the case may be.
So I have a question before Rap jumps in. Okay, you all are bringing science into this, right? Which I never thought, right? You tell a good story, right? You tell about a lived experience. So Jeff and Patrice, like, how did you two know to do this? Like, how did you know to research this? Like, how did this start for both of you? Because I'm so intrigued of what you just told me. How did you know to do this and that this would be effective? Like, and how did you start thinking about this?
So for me, I grew up with storytellers. My grandparents, my mother, my aunts. We grew up learning stories and hearing stories. So understanding the way stories made us feel, the stories of our family made me specifically be empowered to be a Black woman and to know, in spite of whatever injustices that were around me, hearing these stories gave me the strength to do what I needed to do in order to be successful in life. So when Jeff says we grow up with stories, we have grown up in my household with stories all of the time. We grew up listening to Maya Angelou, and Still I Rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the dirt, very dirt, but still like dust I rise. So no matter what we were experiencing as children, whether racism or sexism as children, we knew through the stories that were by poets that were out there, but also through our grandparents. The stories of my grandfather, being at World War II and teaching, the other soldiers how to fight in the army as gunmen, which was rare for Black men. To hear his story about, his rank in the military, my great-grandfather coming from, being a Buffalo soldier. I mean, all of these various stories in our family's lives. My mother helped to integrate public schools. She would talk about, going on trips as high school as a debater and doing debate forensics and, people throwing stuff at the bus and yelling at them because they had an integrated team. All of that empowered me to do better, right? All of that empowered me and moved me in such a way to do better. So understanding the importance of that, we know that as public defenders, if you want to make people feel and do something better, right? Do the right thing, the story is the way you do it. And telling a story effectively is going to get people to do or get to your client's stated interest.
Jeff, how did you know, right, that this would be effective and that you also needed to do the research and the science behind it to prove? Like, how did you know? Like, what
And let
made
me-
you do that?
And Jeff, let me ask, as you answer that, share with folks your third thing, because I think it really ties into this.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess do I need to explain what third thing is first? But I'll tie that in, I guess. I grew up like Patrice. I grew up in a family with stories. And third thing actually comes from my mom's approach to raising me and my sister, and her belief that we should always have three big activities in our lives. because at least one of them would be going well and we'd feel good about ourselves. So for me and my sister, school was always very important. And then we were both involved with theater. And then she would still push us to do other things. So I, tried playing the drums. I did all sorts of other things, sports and things and that usually that was the one that was not as good as the other ones. My current third thing is mainly improvisational theater. And I do scripted shows as well. So I see the world as an improviser and an actor first. And I started doing that when I was 5, doing theater. So for me, it was intuitive that of course it has to be stories.
Okay.
But then as I got more invested in it and trying to teach it, I felt like I needed to do the research to be able to explain to people beyond intuition that, yeah, there's science that backs this up.
Wow.
But it wasn't that I did the science and then convinced myself. It was just I was raised and it was just obvious to me, but I need to find the support for that.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a really powerful quote by Brene Brown. It says, everyone has a story that will break your heart. And if you're really listening, most people have a story that will bring you to your knees, right? This idea that folks have really moving stories. And I think Jeff and Patrice, have done a really good job helping the audience understand why stories are so important, and how you can tell a good story. But most people think of sort of trial work as kind of rigid, structured, and maybe they don't quite get how you tell stories in the context of trial work. And Patrice, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, you've been doing this work with Gideon's Promise for 15 years. You've been running the Gideon's Promise programming in Maryland. You do 2 classes a year. You've been doing that for several years. How do you approach sort of teaching lawyers how to be storytellers as trial lawyers in your training program?
So Gideon's Promise magnifies the importance of storytelling, I would say, throughout every facet of the Core 101 training program, the graduate program, the leadership program, and in every fiber of the organization. Because we are armed with the understanding that people learn differently and retain information differently. So we employ numerous techniques to help train people to how to develop their storytelling skills. So we use visual, audio, reading and writing, and kinesthetic approaches. So take the Core 101 training, for example, during the first week. We start out as a faculty, modeling how to tell a concise 2-minute story, persuasive story about why we want to be public defenders or why we continue to stay in this work. So participants, lawyers who come to the training first start to hear a good story from the faculty, right? They see this modeling of the faculty. Then they, in turn, share why they want to be public defenders, right out the gate, without any practice or time to prepare or anything else. They tell why they want to be a public defender. And so here's this kinesthetic approach, right? They're learning how to be storytellers early on without any instruction. Then they have opportunities to retell their stories. They're given reading material. So they're reading how to tell a story. They're writing out, good stories. And when we say writing out stories, it's not just their own stories, but we incorporate how to, tell a good story when developing your theory of the case, your direct examination questions, during cross-examination and specifically in impeachment, in the accreditation phase of an impeachment, how you are telling a story, even in that moment. So everything in the first week with storytelling and client-centered development and relationships and ethical practice transcends into the second week. So storytelling is weaved throughout the entire training. One of the things that is critical about, the participants sharing their own story, because they share their own story, they tell each other stories, and they learn, one, the importance of listening. Two, they understand the weight of carrying another human being's story and honoring it. And three, they understand or begin to understand how vulnerable our clients must feel when public defenders are telling their stories, right? And not having the ability to add in, not having the ability to speak when you're in a courtroom. So, teaching that part of storytelling is critical. So not just, the way we tell a story, but the effect storytelling has not only on, the fact finder, the judge, the jury, but the effect how telling someone else's story may have on that human being sitting there, right? Their clients.
So with that, Jeff, to tag onto what Patrice was talking about, when we simulate, what Patrice is talking about, Core 101 is for our new listeners, our new public defender program for our newbies. And we do this in the bond hearings, right? We have a simulated bond hearing where our lawyers are presenting in front of a fictitious judge. Jeff, that is in our safety, security. Our lawyers are learning how to do this. They are allowed to make mistakes in learning how to be great storytellers. What impact have you seen this is not on our list, but I just thought of it as, what impact have you seen in the real world with actual clients? And what is it when they hear, what is the reaction when they hear their public defender speaking about their story, whether it is to a prosecutor, to the judge, or to the jury? What have you seen in the courts when you were in the courtroom regularly, when you hear effective storytelling, the client's reaction to it?
It can be a mix depending on how well you've prepared your client and the relationship that you have with your client. And that's why the bond exercise at Gideon's Promise can be really eye-opening and critical for folks to experience having someone else hold your story, but not tell it the way you expected it to be told. So there, if there are situations where clients feel like you left out the most important thing, or I can't believe you told that thing about my mom. I told you that, and I didn't expect you to actually tell the judge about that. So, part of that, when it goes well, is when you have had the conversations with your client so they know what is coming, and then it goes, the complete other direction of you get, people thanking you. There are many, many stories that public defenders have of a client who got what would seem like a horrible result, who is so grateful to the public defender and writing them years later because they told their story and they showed respect. And even if the result wasn't what they wanted, there's a power in that, in holding somebody's story and treating them with humanity that happens frequently.
I appreciate you saying it. It's a power in holding and sharing someone's story. I think oftentimes, as a person who has had family members go through the system, I make sure that public defenders know, they always say the prosecutor is the most powerful player in the courtroom. We can argue about that on another podcast, but I believe that public defenders, because you are literally holding, number one, someone's life in your hands to advocacy, and then also telling their lived experience, like you said, Jeff, can go either way, is very powerful. And it's an important piece, an important thing for public defenders to understand.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that we're having this discussion, because I think the idea that as public defender storytellers, there is, not just a power, but a real responsibility, right? You have other people have entrusted you with their stories and telling them in a way that is true to the person whose story it is, when they're the ones whose liberty or life is on the line. It's just it's another layer of teaching that goes into this. And so that kind of brings me to the next question I want to ask you, Patrice. There are stories that we learn, and you're trying to share them in ways that move an audience. And obviously, audiences are varied. People are different. What impacts people, what hits people varies from person to person. It's based on so many things. And as public defenders, the audience may be a judge, and judges vary from courtroom to courtroom. And it may be a jury where you have 12 different people, right, who come from different walks of life. How do you sort of first do your best to get an understanding of what will move that audience, who is in that audience, and does that affect how you tell the stories?
I think it affects the way you tell the stories, but at the same time, you have to make sure you're honoring your client's requests about how you tell the story, right? So like Jeff said, if the client says, hey, I don't want you to talk about this piece, right? I don't want you to mention maybe the abuse that I received, but in your mind you think, but this will be good. Like this, if I talk about this, this is going to move this particular person to act this way. You still fall back. The fallback is what your client wants, like what your client's stated interest is, what your client's wishes are, and not doing anything to damage or to strip that client's humanity further than what this system has done, right? Because we're in a system that processes and strips people of their dignity and humanity day in and day out. So even if we're trying to figure out, okay, what part of the story is going to motivate and connect this person to do what I want them to do, we still always have to keep in mind what our client's wishes are, right? How do we honor what our client wants? But with that being said, storytelling begins even before a word has been spoken. So throughout Gideon's Promise, we talk about storytelling not only as, the spoken word, but what are the three different stories, right? We talk about the story of the case, which brings us there and gathering stories that surrounds everything. Story of the trial, what is unfolding while we were there at the trial in the courtroom. And this story of justice or innocence, what makes our client heroic, or what makes the fact finder heroic in doing the right thing. So in thinking of that, right, in jury selection, we are going to be telling stories there. We're gathering stories, we're gathering information, what dire means to tell the truth. So hopefully we're gathering, the core values of our jurors such that when it does come time to try the case, we have an understanding, right? Some type of understanding of what is going to motivate these jurors to follow and understand and believe our theory of the case. Same thing with judges, right? You don't just walk into a courtroom without having any knowledge of what, affects this judge, right? The judge's background, what kind of cases they like. There's some judges that, they're not, they're okay with murder, but, burglary is bad because they had their house broken into several times. So if you come in front of them with a burglary case, you've got to be prepared for that. So yes, there are times when, we tell our client stories that we are connecting again with human beings. And again, I don't care if it's, a judge or a jury that you have nothing in common with. Stories are the way to connect with other human beings. Mm-hmm. Stories are the way that, the listener can connect with the speaker. And then within the room, right, going back to the brain science, people hearing the same story have been shown to connect as well. Like their heartbeats start to connect and move in the same way, right? And so they start to see and hear the story in the same way that the speaker is telling the story. So being able to do that is going to help us, get to our client's stated interests in any kind of case. And whether it's, the trial or a motions hearing or a bail argument, having the ability to do that is going to be critical.
So Jeff, when we talk, staying within the context of the courtroom, I'm going to go a little bit before it's time to appear in court. We know nationally, public defenders never have enough time, right? And so what advice would you give public defenders who feel like they just don't have enough time to truly get to know their client before they appear, their first appearance in court, right? What should they focus on about the client's background, or what should they be doing? Because they'll say, Jeff, I love what you did. I love what I was taught, but I simply don't have time. So tell me the quick thing I need to do. What advice would you give them?
just take this pill. And unfortunately, I don't have a magic answer to that. I think that it comes with, some of that comes with experience. The public defenders who practice in the same area can see patterns that emerge and similar stories that emerge. I'll plug in. APD has a great online course that we're starting soon after this podcast that Lori James Towns is leading, and we'll be offering it many times in the future. If you're listening to this a year from now, that's about exploring the cultural mitigation of the history in your area.
Wow.
And how that applies to your storytelling. So knowing, like if you're in Tulsa, knowing the history of Tulsa or wherever you are, where redlining plays into what happened and how something that happened generations ago still plays out in what's happening in the courtroom today. So that would be one starting place, is to know your local history and know the patterns that are there and be able to recognize how they fit into this client's story. May help you a little bit on the time thing, plus take this pill. That's one thing there. But I think it's, that it gets back to the resources and money issue that we constantly face with public defenders. You have to have the time to do it well. And that is something where we can't do it at the level that we could if we had less cases.
Wow.
No, and to that point, I mean, Patrice, you talked about how we do exercises where we start with introductions, which is modeling sort of how do you, when a judge is saying, counsel, you've got 2 minutes, right? How do you use that to tell a powerful story and not waste a lot of time? And I wonder if you have additional thoughts sort of about what is it that you would recommend to public defenders when they're really trying to figure out, like, what are the important things and how do I take an elaborate situation, a complex life, and try to tell the story in a brief and powerful way?
Yes, and Rap, you do bring up a good point, because within the training manual, you give examples, right? We provide examples on how to have these client-centered short conversations when you have to. Right? Ideally, we're pushing back against the system. We're asking for the continuance, and we're saying, no, we need more time to talk with our client. I cannot try this case today. I haven't had adequate time, right? But in the absence of having more time and judges, acting, efficiently and preserving due process, right? And we have to go forward. Really, one, I would say, think about this before you go into court. Before you meet with your clients. One, have a plan, right? Think about how do you have these conversations that are going to, show that you're fighting for your client, show that you are there for them. You're not, this public pretender in this short space. And think about the words you're going to use. So you're not going to sound like the prosecutor. You're not going to sound like the police and accuse them right off the bat, right? You're not going to say, why did you do this? Why did you snatch that person's purse? Think about the language. And so we train them. I only have a few minutes to talk with you today, unfortunately. However, this is when I can talk with you again. This is what the police is saying. Do you know why this witness would say this about you? And really thinking about and finding out what is important to that person in that meeting, right? In that moment, stepping away from your agenda as a lawyer, finding out what is important to them. A lot of times it's, contacting their job, contacting their family. They haven't been on medication. What is, the medication they're not on, specific health conditions that they are facing. You can get to that information in a few sentences, right? You can get to that information just like you talk to another human being and saying, sorry for meeting this way, but how are you doing in this moment? Is there anything I can do to help alleviate the pressures of this situation right now? And then explain the process, right? Explain the process to them in a short period of time so that they know, especially if they're in jail, that you're not going to leave them, right? You're not going to just leave them there. One of the things I have new public defenders think about is if we were in a room locked, one person comes in there and gives you some information and leaves, and you have no idea about when you're going to get out of this room again, when you're going to eat, when you're going to see your family, when you're going to have any other contact to the outside world, except through this one person that comes in and tells you something then leaves. How does that make you feel? And how would you want to be treated in that situation?
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, so all of us do a lot of training. We're all part of a much larger network of defender, trainer, storytellers. There's lots of great training happening across the country. There are places like NLADA and BPDA and NACDL and NCDC and
all these
NAPD,
acronyms.
all these acronyms. So we
For our non-lawyer listeners like myself, lawyers love acronyms. It took me 15 years to learn all these acronyms. And then NAPD came 5-6 years ago, Jeff, and I had to add another set of letters.
So we used to be SPDTC, and Ilham insisted that we change our name to Gideon's Promise. So we're kind of like one of these things is not like the other. We're not an acronym, although we are sometimes GP. But anyway, my GP. But my point is lots of great organizations. And Jeff, you shared a great program you have coming up. Please share any others that you think folks should know about. But I want to ask both of you this, if you have thoughts about this. I think what is clear from this conversation is that as public defenders, we're storytellers in so many spaces, right? We're storytellers at bond hearings. We're storytellers when we're sitting in the prosecutor's office negotiating a plea. We're storytellers when we're meeting with witnesses and we're trying to talk to them about sort of, what to expect, right? Or what they know about a situation. There's so many ways that public defenders are storytellers. And I think that we've come to understand that we have to train public defenders beyond just sort of trial skills or all these spaces where this is important. What type of training do you recommend for public defenders so that they can become better storytellers in all these different areas? And Jeff, let me start with you because I know NAPD is doing a lot of this.
Yeah, I encourage you, if you on the public defender side, if you want to see what NAPD is doing, check out publicdefenders.us is our webpage, and you'll see a calendar there of upcoming webinars, courses, in-person events where we are doing that. But I think it's important to live a life to get back to the third thing. And I was thinking I didn't quite finish out the adult version of the third thing. For most of us is, our work rather than school, like I was saying as a kid, and our family and friends is kind of the second thing. And I think many public defenders stop there, and that's plenty, and their plate is full. And there's certain times in your life where there's no place for a third thing, but having something else that you do in a different community and helps you see what reality and what other people's points of view are. For me, that third thing is about performance and telling stories. And at times you may experiment with that. So I really encourage people to take an improv class. It's amazing on teaching listening skills and connection. It's about making the other person look good. The American approach to improv is about emotions and relationships, where the English version is more about narrative approaches. So you can learn from both of those to apply in our world. One thing that's happened since COVID is you can take improv classes online from the best teachers in the world now, constantly. So look into some of those, or you can take an improv class with my group, Central Kentucky Improv. If you like us on Facebook, we do classes, and you can take a class with me that's taught by our coach. But there's tons of stuff. I'd also encourage people to look into local storytelling classes and writing classes. I think understanding, we haven't talked about a lot about narrative structure. I'm a big fan of the hero's journey approach and there are other ways of describing it that comes from Joseph Campbell. But immersing yourself in learning that, there's a book called The Writer's Journey that's much easier to read than reading Joseph Campbell, which is kind of challenging to read, that explains that hero's journey structure. So those are some things I would encourage people to look into if you're trying to develop your storytelling skills.
Patrice, any other thoughts about what you'd recommend to public defenders to sort of learn to be better storytellers?
Definitely. I first echo what Jeff said in terms of taking improv classes, theater classes. My parents were actors and writers and directors as a part of being professors. And so I became comfortable with telling stories on a stage before I ever set foot in a courtroom. So anything that's going to push public defenders to be comfortable in their own skin, to feel confident enough to just stand up next to somebody and be assured of themselves and say, on behalf of, those are the kind of classes also you want to take, right? Anything that builds your confidence in public speaking, body language. There's so many different courses out there. There's a master class on storytelling. There's classes on body language, understanding how to just use your body and your voice and project. All of that is going to be important. And I think outside of the legal context, practice telling stories with your family, practice telling stories with your friends. If there are any, if you have any kids in your family or in your circle, read to them. Even reading like the basic children's book gives you the opportunity to practice inflection, to see when somebody becomes engaged and when they're disengaged, depending on how you're telling the story. And think about what are good storytellers. I love music, right? So my musicians and, hip hop artists were my storytellers, in addition to those singing prose and are doing prose and poetry. So, watching people, listening to other people, figuring out styles that move you, and see if there's parts that you can adopt in the way you tell stories. Now, of course, you have to be authentic. You can't adopt anybody else's style. You can't try to be another storyteller other than who you are. But figuring out ways to do that and gather information is going to be critical. I like the fact Jeff, talked about this class in terms of how to raise race and culture within your storytelling, within your cases, because that's critical. That's critical. And for so many public defenders, they're afraid to do it, right? I mean, it's one thing to, know how to tell a great story, but you have to be confident enough to talk about issues of race and culture and gender discrimination and historic systemic, issues within your clients' lives, because that's a part of the story. That's a part of your theory of the case oftentimes. And you've got to be able to have training on that and be confident enough in order to do it. So really just figuring out ways to practice it, to learn more about, your clients and, the communities that they come from are going to be critical. There's a Nigerian writer and novelist and storyteller, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she does a TED talk on the danger of a single story. And we show that at Gideon's Promise. We talk about the danger of the single story. And one of the things she says is that stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize, right? Stories can also repair broken dignity. And so you have to do the work, right? You can't just go to one session and be like, okay, I'm a great storyteller, right? Or, I sat in this class and so now I've got it. No, the criminal system constantly strips away our clients' humanity and dignity. And if we know and we realize and we know the brain science and everything else that storytelling matters, then we have an obligation as public defenders to educate ourselves, to train ourselves, to practice being excellent storytellers.
I just
Jeff,
want
you
to
were gonna
add
get-
one thing
Jeff-
about the acting classes and the value of that. I emphasized improv, which has its own value. The value of working in an acting class where you're working with a script is what you're going to learn when I'm playing a character in a scripted show. I'm looking at every single line and asking, why are they saying that? What do they want? It's what's my motivation, as a famous actor's question that's there. And putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and very intentionally thinking through every single moment of what happens is what we do as public defenders, but it's the core of what you are trained as an actor. So while it's great fun to do that as an actor, as well as a good release for those of you in public defense to do something else, it is also training your brain to notice these things and experience them and be able to find the whys that inform the theory of the case that you're developing.
Wow.
Illy, before
So,
you ask the last question, I just want to say thank you, because you made me think. I mean, the importance of listening to good storytellers, whether they're poets or musicians or actors, it's so critical. And honestly, I want to thank Patrice and Jeff, because Illy and I have two kids who have grown up watching great storytellers, you guys, other public defenders, when they come to Gideon's Promise.
and they're getting good, guys, by the way.
They're getting good.
They're getting really good. I think Rap and I are done standing on the big stage at the next event. We're done.
You can't tell when they tell us a story if it's true or not. We just believe them now. But yeah, they show up and they get on stage and they're learning from you. And so I think, in my own house, I watch children, and I know you've both brought your kids to Gideon's Promise. Our families are part of this. And it really is just listening to great orators, speakers, such a powerful thing to do. So I want to say thank you before Illy takes over and winds us down.
I always take over. I've been taking over, Rap. No, so Jeff, Patrice, this is a little off script, but to give you a few seconds to think. Two of the best storytellers I know. We always introduce introductions for our new class of why you're a public defender, or what brought you here, or why are you here. So can I ask both of you, if you need a minute, that's fine, to take about a minute and a half to tell why you are a public defender, and tell your short story to our audience. Can you do that?
And we can pause so you could think about it.
We can pause so you can think about
But
it.
it'd be great if you could maybe give a little model of what we mean by that.
Yeah, model. We would love for you to model what
You can also opt out. Like, we don't want to put you on the spot. If
Yeah.
you're willing to do it, you might.
I
But
think
if
both
you
of us
can-
have done this story 1,000 times.
You're
so
right. So
get
if
ready,
you could model this for our listeners, it would be a great way to end this part.
I was born in the wrong generation. That's what I grew up telling myself in the early 80s, growing up in Lawrence, Kansas, that there was no great civil rights battle to be fought. Reagan was president. There were some things that were wrong in the world, but I felt like I should have been there in the 60s, that I wanted to believe that I would have been brave enough to be there for Mississippi Summer, or to be on the Freedom Riders buses. I don't know if I would have been or not, but I wanted to believe that that's the generation I should have been in. But I was born in the wrong generation. That's what I was telling myself as a teenager. And I got involved in things, back then there was an anti-apartheid movement, and we got Kansas University to divest, and that had some impact. And I was living like most people in that time period, and especially most white people in that time period, oblivious to what was happening in the criminal justice system. And what I've come to learn by getting involved with the criminal justice system, I was an actor. I was doing theater and making my living doing children's theater and outdoor drama, and ended up falling in love and moving to Lexington, Kentucky, and not going to move from there. And my plan was to go to law school, get rich, and then go back into theater and do the theater stuff that I wanted to do. But I ended up being a public defender clerk my first summer. And that's where I started to see what was going on, and that the civil rights battle of the 60s had never ended and was still going on. And there's a great quote that I learned from Rap that I think comes from James Foreman Jr., that this generation civil rights battle is indigent defense. And becoming involved as a public defender in the late 90s, I've learned that I was born in exactly the right generation. And over the last few years, it's blatantly obvious that it was the right generation. I'd been missing it all this time, and most of the world had been missing it all this time. But if you want to do civil rights work, if you want to make a difference in the world, whether that's helping one client at a time or helping many at a time or just being involved in the fight, the place to be is working in public defense.
I gotta unmute and just
I'm over here screaming. Thank you, Jeff. Patrice, why are you a public defender? What brought you here?
I was raised by activist parents, high school and college and university educators who fought to integrate public institutions, marched with Dr. King, and also joined the Black Panthers. They named me Patrice after Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Congo, who gave his life and was assassinated for fighting for true liberation and true independence of his people. My heroes were Harriet Tubman, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Che Guevara, and songs of freedom rang through our home. Ain't gonna let nobody, Lord, turn me round, turn me round. So I was destined to have the heart, the mind, and the soul of the public defender. My parents instilled into me, to whom much is given, much is required. So I fought as a public defender in Georgia for over 13 years, and my soul bore witness to the atrocities of this oppressive system. Men, women, children shackled and housed in deplorable conditions. People who were considered poor in other eyes because of the color of their skin, Black and brown people. Tried cases in courtrooms where the trees that once lynched human beings still stood. To whom much is given, much is required. So as a law professor, my scholarship shed light on the horrors of the prison industrial complex. And now my goal as a trainer is to train public defenders and support public defenders in the state of Maryland, in Gideon's Promise, and throughout this country who are committed to continuing the fight for a more just and humane society. So I chose to be a public defender. I still continue to be a public defender because I choose to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem.
Thank you, Patrice. I want to see y'all live and in person to hug you so badly. It's been way too long. I want to thank you for joining us today on National Tell a Story Day. Patrice Fulcher, the Director of Training in the Office of Public Defender, Maryland, and Jeff Sherr, Director of Training for the National Association for Public Defense. I thank you so much for joining us on April 27th, this great day with some great storytellers. And I hope our listeners have learned a lot from you today. In true former fashion, I am Ilham Askia.
and I am Jonathan Wrapping
Wrapping it up.
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.